Many moons ago, the Reverend Teddy Hickman Maynard and Community Life at the BU School of Theology preached a series sermon at Hope Central on today's gospel reading, known as the parable of the workers in the vineyard. It was one of those sermons that struck me in profound ways that reverberate even to this day. First shall be last, and the last shall be first certainly leaps off the page as a kind of divine redistribution. But what's easy to miss and what Teddy powerfully zeroed in on were verses 6 and 7, which again read, about 5 p.m, he went out and found still others. He asked them, "Why have you been standing here all day long doing nothing?" "Because no one has hired us," they answered. If there's one thing that many of us have learned in our social justice work, it's the importance of understanding the root causes of oppression. And in this parable, we learn that there are workers who are able and willing, but they lack opportunity. And without opportunity, we know that inequality and inequity flourish. Therefore, we can rightly read this parable as an example of redistributive justice, an act of reparations. And we can celebrate that the disenfranchised workers get their fair share and now have opportunities historically denied to them. But I'm left with an uneasy feeling that there's more to the story. Why do I say this? Let me answer where we are told that God created humankind in its image and told them to be fruitful and multiply and subdue, in some translations, the earth. Now, there's a lot to unpack in these verses, and we can interpret them all along the spectrum, particularly the references to subduing or ruling over, which again, in certain translations, that's the way it reads. Now, the kindest and gentlest reading is one of stewardship, which is the reading we heard today, the interpretation. But there's other interpretations that are around subduing and controlling. And if we choose that interpretation, then what follows is what we see in our, with little concern for long-term consequences, a world that's getting hotter, and economic systems that valorize growth at the expense of the environment and create massive inequality. My uneasiness with the parable, or for that matter, any efforts at equity, is that we must ask deeper questions and have broader concerns than material restitution. Otherwise, the recipients of repair run the very real risk of being co-opted into systems where they perpetuate further exploitation and degradation. For example, what if the workers are employed by a corporation that produces toxic waste that pollutes a community? It means that I must ask, in the US context, what does it mean to gain material benefit from a system built on the backs of my ancestors? Put another way, what does it mean to benefit from a system that exploits? It means wrestling with that question and beginning to imagine systems that are more humane and more just. First, though, it requires that we reckon with history and its consequences, which is what Olufemi Taiwo does when he states, "We are still living out the consequences of the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, which established global patterns of wealth and resource accumulation that push some countries towards failure and others towards success, decades after many colonialized countries gained independence." And there's more. If we think about environmental justice and climate change, in other words, that they dole out damage in profoundly unequal ways. This is visible not just between countries, but also within them. The theft of land from indigenous people in our North America, for instance, has made their descendants more vulnerable to extreme heat and drought. This all leads him to ask an unsettling question about the potentially myopic ways we approach racial justice and repair efforts. He puts it this way: are any of these measures we take towards racial justice going to have staying power in a world that's 3 degrees hotter? What I hear in this question is the absolute imperative that we consider the long-term consequences of our actions, much like the native concept of the 7th generation principle that asserts that any decisions being made about energy, water, and natural resources are made in such a way that factor in the well-being of all for 7 generations in the future. What's abundantly clear is that without broader care and concern for our environments, any attempts at reparations narrowly will likely fail, because the communities most in need of repair are in fact the same communities that are vulnerable to the pernicious effects of climate change. Communities with urban heat islands, rising sea levels, and the like. And by connecting these dots, it becomes apparent that connected to climate change are economic systems that promulgate the idea that more is better, that growth is the goal, and that the market is the ultimate arbiter of our livelihoods. But there are other ways of being and seeing the world that challenge the market-based orthodoxy that has become an idol in the United States. Capitalism and democracy have become synonymous, which illustrates the nature of the problem we as a country have. Many fail to acknowledge that any economic system where the wealthy few have inordinate power to shape the lives of the many is actually the antithesis of what a democracy should be. Therefore, the parable of the workers in the vineyard is a kind of antidote to inequity, as it illustrates a keen moral awareness of how systems work to deny groups of individuals access to basic needs. And yet, when we dig a little deeper, it's clear that there's an underlying belief that the system itself creates winners and losers. Note that the workers who started to grumble because they believed that they were owed more. And while it's clear, it's great to hear the owners chasten these workers by extolling his graciousness, one has to wonder what the story might look like if we were to keep the cameras rolling, so to speak. Would the workers who felt that they were owed more become increasingly resentful and disgruntled and target those workers who were shown generosity? This is not an abstract exercise, beloved. This is, in fact, our history. This is Tulsa. This is Wilmington. This is the breathtaking lack of graciousness we saw from many this last week as President Biden canceled student loan debt for millions, a disproportionate number of them being Black and brown folks. This is USA. Without a doubt, what's desperately needed is a change of heart. We all need to be as gracious as the vineyard owner, and that comes by being in relationship with one another, being proximate, as Brian Stevenson puts it. It requires a radical solidarity that can serve as a portal to liberation for not just us humans, but for all creation. And it requires that we understand that inequality is the enemy rather than people. This has never been more clear to me than now. As many of you know, David and I traveled last month to Iceland, and it was breathtaking. We spent 10 days there and got to see landscapes that ran the gamut between lush and green to barren and lunar. But it was also sobering, especially when we learned about the massive retreat of glaciers due to climate change, and to hear that the melting of those glaciers has been accelerating. Even closer, we now live in Chelsea, a city that has what are known as economic sacrifice zones. These are defined as fence-line communities of low-income people and people of color, or hotspots of chemical pollution where residents live immediately adjacent to heavily polluted industries. Of course, I'm abundantly aware that such zones litter the earth, and that there are actually entire countries that could be considered environmental sacrifice zones. It goes without saying that there is much reason to despair about all of this because it feels so insurmountable, that's for sure. And yet what I've come to realize is that this provides us with an invitation to broaden our understanding of what reparations means. It means refashioning our world to be grounded in an understanding that environmental justice stems from racial justice. It means reimagining Genesis to include all of a creation fashioned in God's image, including Cody and Riley and Jean-Luc. It means, beloved, each of us doing our parts in a world-making project that sustains all of life for all generations of beings to come. And then the lyrics to that lovely song, What a Wonderful World, become more than sentiment. They become a reality. Amen.
I used to dream, I used to glance beyond the stars, and now I don't know where we are, although I know we drifted far.